They not only want to see a civil war, they have initiated one. Look, this has progressed already beyond farce into tragedy. When as many as 46 people were burnt to death in the trade union headquarters on May the 2nd in Odessa, according to one city councilman in that city, the death toll was 116. When something like this occurs, and moreover, when the U.S.-installed junta in Kiev launches a full-fledged military offensive into the Donetsk or the Donbass region, and we're talking about estimates of up to 15,000 Ukrainian troops, many of them trained by the U.S. and NATO in so-called interoperability, and who are veterans in many instances of deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, amongst other places, Kosovo as well. And these 15,000 troops are accompanied by several hundred armored vehicles, including tanks, field artillery, attack helicopters. This is a full-fledged war against the civilian population of part of their country. In the words of Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and I'm quoting him almost verbatim, the government in Kiev, if one wants to call it a government, the regime in Kiev, has been collaborating with neo-Nazis against its own people, nothing less. And I agree with your other guests that the deafening silence, if you will, emanating from Western governments and from Western media is one of the more shameful episodes in human history and will be recorded as such. Now, the other issue is whether or not the U.S. has contingency plans and NATO has contingency plans that allow it to exploit any crisis in the Ukraine. We have to keep in mind, first of all, just to frame this entire debate, that there was to have been a presidential election in March of next year. It is roughly a year from the time this whole crisis occurred. This was a bloody coup d'etat that not only resulted in the deaths afterwards in eastern Ukraine and in Odessa, but we have to recall the repulsive videos of police officers in Kiev being set on fire by petrol bombs without a word emanating from the U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt, more concerned as he was to stage the coup than to respond to something that, had it occurred in any Western capital, he would have been the first to condemn.
Brian, it's very interesting with what Rick just said there, because it's really interesting because there was a planned presidential election, and Yanukovych could have won or lost, but it would have been an election. I find it very interesting that this is this neocon mindset. You know, first of all, they want payback for Syria. I understand that. But again, when you look at a country like Ukraine and the vast power of the West, they want to be the decision makers. They want to decide who controls what, who's in what position. I find it a very interesting mindset because it is antithetical to anything that we call a democratic process.
Right. I mean, Yanukovych sat with the opposition on February 21st and signed an agreement that said there will be a diminution of presidential power, there will be early elections, there will be early elections prior to December, in other words, even ahead of the planned March elections for 2015. In other words, Yanukovych essentially agreed under the auspices and with sitting with them, the German and Polish and French foreign minister and a Russian observer, he agreed to that. And then he went along with the program, which was to withdraw the police, in other words, to pledge nonviolence at that moment to try to lessen the crisis, lessen the tension. And it was then that the fascist militias, the neo-Nazis, seized the government building and declared a new government in a rump session of parliament. And it was then that the U.S. government said, this is a new day for Ukraine. In other words, it was the State Department that celebrated a neo-Nazi coup. And none of that was presented in the U.S. media for the American people as anything other than the triumph of freedom. I mean, when you go back to where you started in terms of Orwellian doublespeak and presentation, this is hard to match.